Hello, I'm Tony Walker and I am the narrator of the Classic Detective Stories podcast. And this week I'm bringing you The Mystery of the Sleeping Car Express by Freeman Wills Crofts, which is a classic locked room mystery. I hope you enjoy it. The Mystery of the Sleeping Car Express by Freeman Wills Crofts. No one who was in England in the autumn of 1909 can fail to remember the terrible tragedy which took place in a North-Western express between Preston and Carlisle. The affair attracted enormous attention at the time, not only because of the arresting nature of the events themselves, but even more for the absolute mystery in which they were shrouded. Quite lately, a singular chance has revealed to me the true explanation of the terrible drama, and it is at the express desire of its chief actor that I now take upon myself to make the facts known. As it is a long time since 1909, I may perhaps be pardoned if I first recall the events which came to light at the time. One Thursday, then, early in November of the year in question, the 10:30 p.m. sleeping car train left Euston, as usual, for Edinburgh, Glasgow, and the north. It was generally a heavy train, being popular with businessmen who like to complete their day's work in London, sleep while travelling, and arrive at their northern destination with time for a leisurely bath and breakfast before office hours. The night in question was no exception to the rule, and two engines hauled behind them 8 large sleeping cars, 2 firsts, 2 thirds, and 2 vans, half of which went to Glasgow and the remainder to Edinburgh. It is essential to the understanding of what follows that the composition of the rear portion of the train should be remembered. At the extreme end came the Glasgow van, a long 8-wheeled bogie vehicle with Guard Jones in charge. Next to the van was one of the third-class coaches, and immediately in front of it came a first class, both labelled for the same city. These coaches were fairly well filled, particularly the third class. In front of the first class came the last of the 4 Glasgow sleepers. The train was a corridor throughout, and the officials could and did pass through it several times during the journey. It is with the first-class coach that we are principally concerned, and it will be understood from the above that it was placed in between the sleeping car in front and the third class behind, the van following immediately behind the third. It had a lavatory at each end and 6 compartments, the last 2 next to the third class being smokers, the next 3 non-smoking, and the first immediately beside the sleeping car a ladies only. The corridors in both it and the third-class coach were on the left-hand side in the direction of travel. That is, the compartments were on the side of the double line. The night was dark as the train drew out of Euston, for there was no moon and the sky was overcast. As was remembered and commented on afterwards, there had been an unusually long spell of dry weather, and though it looked like rain earlier in the evening, none fell till the next day, when, about 6 in the morning, there was a torrential downpour. As the detectives pointed out later, no weather could have been more unfortunate from their point of view, as, had footmarks been made during the night, the ground would have been too hard to take good impressions, while even such traces as remained would more than likely have been blurred by the rain. The train ran to time, stopping at Rugby, Crewe, and Preston. After leaving the latter station, Guard Jones found he had occasion to go forward to speak to a ticket collector in the Edinburgh portion. He accordingly left his van in the rear and passed along the corridor of the third-class carriage adjoining. At the end of this corridor, beside the vestibule joining it to the first class, were a lady and gentleman, evidently husband and wife, the lady endeavouring to soothe the cries of a baby she was carrying. Guard Jones addressed some civil remark to the man, who explained that their child had been taken ill, and they had brought it out of their compartment as it was disturbing the other passengers. With an expression of sympathy, Jones unlocked the 2 doors across the corridor at the vestibule between the carriages, and, passing on into the first-class coach, reclosed them behind him. They were fitted with spring locks, which became fast on the door shutting. The corridor of the first-class coach was empty, and as Jones walked down it he observed that the blinds of all the compartments were lowered, with one exception, that of the ladies only. In this compartment, which contained 3 ladies, the light was fully on, and the guard noticed that 2 of the 3 were reading. Continuing his journey, Jones found that the 2 doors at the vestibule between the first-class coach and the sleeper were also locked, and he opened them and passed through, shutting them behind him. At the sleeping-car attendant's box, just inside the last of these doors, 2 car attendants were talking together. One was actually inside the box, the other standing in the corridor. The latter moved aside to let the guard pass, taking up his former position, as, after exchanging a few words, Jones moved on. His business with the ticket collector finished, Guard Jones returned to his van. On this journey he found the same conditions obtaining as on the previous. The 2 attendants were at the rear end of the sleeping car, the lady and gentleman with the baby in the front end of the third-class coach, the first-class corridor deserted, and both doors at each end of the latter coach locked. These details, casually remarked at the time, became afterwards of the utmost importance, adding as they did to the mystery in which the tragedy was enveloped. About an hour before the train was due at Carlisle, while it was passing through the wild moorland country of the Westmoreland Highlands, the brakes were applied, at first gently, and then with considerable power. Guard Jones, who was examining parcel waybills in the rear end of his van, supposed it to be a signal check. But as such was unusual at this place, he left his work, and walking down the van, lowered the window at the left-hand side and looked out along the train. The line happened to be in a cutting, and the railway bank for some distance ahead was dimly illuminated by the light from the corridors of the first and third-class coaches immediately in front of his van. As I have said, the night was dark, and, except for this bit of bank, Jones could see nothing ahead. The railway curved away to the right, so, thinking he might see better from the other side, he crossed the van and looked out of the opposite window next the up line. There were no signal lights in view, nor anything to suggest the cause of the slack, but as he ran his eye along the train, he saw that something was amiss in the first-class coach. From the window at its rear end, figures were leaning, gesticulating wildly, as if to attract attention to some grave and pressing danger. The guard at once ran through the third-class coach to this coach, and there he found a strange and puzzling state of affairs. The corridor was still empty, but the centre blind of the rear compartment, that is, the first reached by the guard, had been raised. Through the glass, Jones could see that the compartment contained 4 men. 2 were leaning out of the window on the opposite side, and 2 were fumbling at the latch of the corridor door, as if trying to open it. Jones caught hold of the outside handle to assist, but they pointed in the direction of the adjoining compartment, and the guard, obeying their signs, moved on to the second door. The centre blind of this compartment had also been pulled up, though here again the door had not been opened. As the guard peered in through the glass, he saw that he was in the presence of a tragedy. Tugging desperately at the handle of the corridor door stood a lady, her face blanched, her eyes starting from her head, and her features frozen into an expression of deadly fear and horror. As she pulled, she kept glancing over her shoulder, as if some dreadful apparition lurked in the shadows behind it. As Jones sprang forward to open the door, his eyes followed the direction of her gaze, and he drew in his breath sharply. At the far side of the compartment, facing the engine and huddled down in the corner, was the body of a woman. She lay limp and inert, with head tilted back at an unnatural angle into the cushions, and a hand hanging helplessly down over the edge of the seat. She might have been 30 years of age, and was dressed in a reddish-brown fur coat with toque to match, but these details the guard hardly glanced at, his attention being riveted to her forehead. There, above the left eyebrow, was a sinister little hole, from which the blood had oozed down the coat and formed a tiny pool on the seat. That she was dead was obvious. But this was not all. On the seat opposite her lay a man, and, as far as Guard Jones could see, he also was dead. He apparently had been sitting in the corner seat and had fallen forward so that his chest lay across the knees of the woman, and his head hung down towards the floor. He was all bunched and twisted up, just a shapeless mass in a grey frieze overcoat, with dark hair at the back of what could be seen of his head. But under that head the guard caught the glint of falling drops, while a dark, ominous stain grew on the floor beneath. Jones flung himself on the door, but it would not move. It stood fixed, an inch open, jammed in some mysterious way, imprisoning the lady with her terrible companions. As she and the guard strove to force it open, the train came to a standstill. At once it occurred to Jones that he could now enter the compartment from the opposite side. Shouting to reassure the now almost frantic lady, he turned back to the end compartment, intending to pass through it onto the line, and so back to that containing the bodies. But here he was again baffled, for the two men had not succeeded in sliding back their door. He seized a handle to help them, and then he noticed their companions had opened the opposite door and were climbing out onto the permanent way. It flashed through his mind that an up train passed about this time, and fearing an accident, he ran down the corridor to the sleeping car, where he felt sure he would find a door that would open. That, at the near end, was free, and he leaped out onto the track. As he passed, he shouted to one of the attendants to follow him, and to the others to remain where he was and let no one pass. Then he joined the men who had already alighted, warned them about the up train, and the four opened the outside door of the compartment in which the tragedy had taken place. Their first concern was to get the uninjured lady out, and here a difficult and ghastly task awaited them. The door was blocked by the bodies, and its narrowness prevented more than one man from working. Sending the car attendant to search the train for a doctor, Jones clambered up, and after warning the lady not to look at what he was doing, he raised the man's body and propped it back in the corner seat. The face was a strong one, with clean-shaven but rather coarse features, a large nose, and a heavy jaw. In the neck, just below the right ear, was a bullet hole, which, owing to the position of the head, had bled freely. As far as the guard could see, the man was dead, not without a certain shrinking. Jones raised the feet, first of the man and then of the woman, and placed them on the seats, thus leaving the floor clear, except for its dark, creeping pool. Then, placing his handkerchief over the dead woman's face, he rolled back the end of the carpet to hide its sinister stain. "Now, ma'am, if you please," he said, and keeping the lady with her back to the more gruesome object on the opposite seat, he helped her to the open door, from where willing hands assisted her to the ground. By this time the attendant had found a doctor in the third-class coach, and a brief examination enabled him to pronounce both victims dead. The blinds in the compartment having been drawn down and the outside door locked, the guard called to these passengers who had alighted to resume their seats with a view to continuing their journey. The fireman had meantime come back along the train to ascertain what was wrong, and to say the driver was unable completely to release the brake. An examination was therefore made, and the telltale disc at the end of the first-class coach was found to be turned, showing that someone in that carriage had pulled the communication chain. This, as is perhaps not generally known, allows air to pass between the train pipe and the atmosphere, thereby gently applying the brake and preventing its complete release. Further investigation showed that the slack of the chain was hanging in the end smoking compartment, indicating that the alarm must have been operated by one of the four men who travelled there. The disc was then turned back to normal, the passengers reseated, and the train started after a delay of about 15 minutes. Before reaching Carlisle, Guard Jones took the name and address of everyone travelling in the first and third-class coaches, together with the numbers of their tickets. These coaches, as well as the van, were thoroughly searched, and it was established beyond any doubt that no one was concealed under the seats, in the lavatories, behind luggage, or in fact anywhere about them. One of the sleeping car attendants, having been in the corridor in the rear of the last sleeper from the Preston stop till the completion of this search, and being positive no one except the guard had passed during that time, it was not considered necessary to take the names of the passengers in the sleeping cars, but the numbers of their tickets were noted. On arrival at Carlisle, the matter was put into the hands of the police. The first-class carriage was shunted off, the doors being locked and sealed, and the passengers who had travelled in it were detained to make their statements. Then began a most careful and searching investigation, as a result of which several additional facts became known. The first step taken by the authorities was to make an examination of the country surrounding the point at which the train had stopped, in the hope of finding traces of some stranger on the line. The tentative theory was that a murder had been committed, and that the murderer had escaped from the train when it stopped, struck across the country, and gaining some road had made good his escape. Accordingly, as soon as it was light, a special train brought a force of detectives to the place, and the railway, as well as a tract of ground on each side of it, was subjected to a prolonged and exhaustive search. But no traces were found. Nothing that a stranger might have dropped was picked up. No footsteps were seen, no marks discovered. As has already been stated, the weather was against the searchers. The drought of the previous days had left the ground hard and unyielding, so that clear impressions were scarcely to be expected, while even such as might have been made were not likely to remain after the downpour of the early morning. Baffled at this point, the detectives turned their attention to the stations in the vicinity. There were only two within walking distance of the point of the tragedy, and at neither had any stranger been seen. Further, no trains had stopped at either of these stations. Indeed, not a single train, either passenger or goods, had stopped anywhere in the neighbourhood since the sleeping car express went through. If the murderer had left the express, it was therefore out of the question that he could have escaped by rail. The investigators then turned their attention to the country roads and adjoining towns, trying to find the trail, if there was a trail, while it was hot. But here again no luck attended their efforts. If there were a murderer, and if he had left the train when it stopped, he had vanished into thin air. No traces of him could anywhere be discovered. Nor were their researches in other directions much more fruitful. The dead couple were identified as a Mr. and Mrs. Horatio Llewellyn of Gordon Villa, Broad Road, Halifax. Mr. Llewellyn was the junior partner of a large firm of Yorkshire iron founders. A man of 35, he moved in good society, and had some claim to wealth. He was of kindly, though somewhat passionate disposition, and, so far as could be learnt, had not an enemy in the world. His firm was able to show that he had business appointments in London on the Thursday and in Carlisle on the Friday, so that his travelling by the train in question was quite in accordance with his known plans. His wife was the daughter of a neighbouring merchant, a pretty girl of some 27. They had been married only a little over a month, and had, in fact, only a week earlier returned from their honeymoon. Whether Mrs. Llewellyn had any definite reason for accompanying her husband on the fatal journey could not be ascertained. She also, so far as was known, had no enemy, nor could any motive for the tragedy be suggested. The extraction of the bullets proved that the same weapon had been used in each case, a revolver of small bore and modern design. But as many thousands of similar revolvers existed, this discovery led to nothing. Miss Blair Booth, the lady who had travelled with the Llewellyns, stated she had joined the train at Euston and occupied one of the seats next to the corridor. A couple of minutes before starting, the deceased had arrived, and they sat in the two opposite corners. No other passengers had entered the compartment during the journey, nor had any of the three left it, in fact. Except for the single visit of the ticket collector shortly after leaving Euston, the door into the corridor had not even been opened. Mr. Llewellyn was very attentive to his young wife, and they had conversed for some time after starting. Then, after consulting Miss Blair Booth, he had pulled down the blinds and shaded the light, and they had settled down for the night. Miss Blair Booth had slept at intervals, but each time she wakened she had looked round the compartment and everything was as before. Then she was suddenly aroused from a doze by a loud explosion close by. She sprang up, and as she did so a flash came from somewhere near her knee, and a second explosion sounded. Startled and trembling, she pulled the shade off the lamp, and then she noticed a little cloud of smoke just inside the corridor door, which had been opened about an inch, and smelled the characteristic odour of burnt powder. Swinging round, she was in time to see Mr. Llewellyn dropping heavily forward across his wife's knees, and then she observed the mark on the latter's forehead and realized that they had both been shot. Terrified, she raised the blind of the corridor door which covered the handle and tried to get out to call assistance, but she couldn't move the door, and her horror was not diminished when she found herself locked in with what she rightly believed were two dead bodies. In despair, she pulled the communication chain, but the train did not appear to stop, and she continued struggling with the door. After what seemed to her hours, the guard appeared, and she was eventually released. In answer to a question, she further stated that when her blind went up, the corridor was empty, and she saw no one till the guard came. The four men in the end compartment were members of one party travelling from London to Glasgow. For some time after leaving they had played cards, but about midnight they too had pulled down their blinds, shaded their lamp, and composed themselves to sleep. In this case also, no person other than the ticket collector had entered the compartment during the journey, but after leaving Preston the door had been opened. Aroused by the stop, one of the gentlemen had eaten some fruit, and having thereby soiled his fingers, he washed them in the lavatory. The door then opened as usual. This man saw no one in the corridor, nor did he notice anything out of the common. Some time after this, all four were startled by the sound of two shots. At first, they thought they were fog signals. Then, realizing they were too far from the engine to hear such, they, like Miss Blair Booth, unshaded their lamp, raised the blind over their corridor door, and endeavoured to leave the compartment. Like her, they found themselves unable to open their door, and, like her also, they saw that there was no one in the corridor. Believing something serious had happened, they pulled the communication chain, at the same time lowering the outside window and waving from it in the hope of attracting attention. The chain came down easily, as if slack, and this explained the apparent contradiction between Miss Blair Booth's statement that she had pulled it and the fact that the slack was found hanging in the end compartment. Evidently the lady had pulled it first, applying the brake, and the second pull had simply transferred the slack from one compartment to the next. The two compartments in front of that of the tragedy were found to be empty when the train stopped, but in the last of the non-smoking compartments were two gentlemen, and in the ladies only three ladies. All these had heard the shots, but so faintly above the noise of the train that the attention of none of them was specially arrested, nor had they attempted any investigation. The gentlemen had not left their compartment or pulled up their blinds between the time the train left Preston and the emergency stop, and could throw no light whatever on the matter. The three ladies in the end compartment were a mother and two daughters, and had got in at Preston. As they were alighting at Carlisle, they had not wished to sleep, so they had left their blinds up and their light unshaded. Two of them were reading, but the third was seated at the corridor side, and this lady stated positively that no one except the guard had passed while they were in the train. She described his movements, first towards the engine, secondly backwards towards the van, and a third time running towards the engine after the train had stopped, so accurately in accord with the other evidence that considerable reliance was placed on her testimony. The stoppage and the guard's haste had aroused her interest, and all three ladies had immediately come out into the corridor and had remained there till the train proceeded, and all three were satisfied that no one else had passed during that time. An examination of the doors which had jammed so mysteriously revealed the fact that a small wooden wedge, evidently designed for the purpose, had been driven in between the floor and the bottom of the framing of the door, holding the latter rigid. It was evident, therefore, that the crime was premeditated, and the details had been carefully worked out beforehand. The most careful search of the carriage failed to reveal any other suspicious object or mark. On comparing the tickets issued with those held by the passengers, a discrepancy was discovered. All were accounted for except one. A first single for Glasgow had been issued at Euston for the train in question, which had not been collected. The purchaser had therefore either not travelled at all, or had got out at some intermediate station. In either case, no demand for a refund had been made. The collector, who had checked the tickets after the train left London, believed, though he could not speak positively, that two men had then occupied the non-smoking compartment next to that in which the tragedy had occurred, one of whom held a Glasgow ticket and the other a ticket for an intermediate station. He could not recollect which station, nor could he describe either of the men, if indeed they were there at all. But the ticket collector's recollection was not at fault, for the police succeeded in tracing one of these passengers, a Dr. Hill, who had got out at Crewe. He was able, partially, at all events, to account for the missing Glasgow ticket. It appeared that when he joined the train at Euston, a man of about 35 was already in the compartment. This man had fair hair, blue eyes, and a full moustache, and was dressed in dark, well-cut clothes. He had no luggage, but only a waterproof and a paper-covered novel. The two travellers had got into conversation, and on the stranger learning that the doctor lived at Crewe, said he was alighting there also, and asked to be recommended to an hotel. He then explained that he had intended to go on to Glasgow and had taken a ticket to that city, but had since decided to break his journey to visit a friend in Chester next day. He asked the doctor if he thought his ticket would be available to complete the journey the following night, and if not, whether he could get a refund. When they reached Crewe, both these travellers had alighted, and the doctor offered to show his acquaintance the entrance to the Crewe Arms, but the stranger, thanking him, declined, saying he wished to see his luggage. Dr. Hill saw him walking towards the van as he left the platform. Upon interrogating the staff on duty at Crewe at the time, no one could recall seeing such a man at the van, nor had any inquiries about the luggage been made. But as these facts did not come to light until several days after the tragedy, confirmation was hardly to be expected. Visits to all the hotels in Crewe and Chester revealed the fact that no one in any way resembling the stranger had stayed there, nor could any trace whatever be found of him. Such were the principal facts made known at the adjourned inquest on the bodies of Mr. and Mrs. Llewellyn. It was confidently believed that the solution to the mystery would speedily be found, but as day after day passed away without bringing to light any fresh information, public interest began to wane and became directed into other channels. But for a time controversy over the affair waxed keen. At first it was argued that it was a case of suicide, some holding that Mr. Llewellyn had shot first his wife and then himself, others that both had died by the wife's hand, but this theory had only to be stated to be disproved. Several persons hastened to point out that not only had the revolver disappeared, but on neither body was there powder blackening, and it was admitted that such a wound could not be self-inflicted without leaving marks from this source. That murder had been committed was therefore clear. Rebutted on this point, the theorists then argued that Miss Blair Booth was the assassin, but here again the suggestion was quickly negatived. The absence of motive, her known character, and the truth of such of her statements as could be checked were against the idea. The disappearance of the revolver was also in her favour. As it was not in the compartment, nor concealed about her person, she could only have rid herself of it out of the window. But the position of the bodies prevented access to the window, and as her clothes were free from any stain of blood, it was impossible to believe she had moved these grim relics, even had she been physically able. But the point that finally demonstrated her innocence was the wedging of the corridor door. It was obvious she could not have wedged the door on the outside and then passed through it. The belief was universal that whoever wedged the door fired the shots. The fact that the former was wedged an inch open strengthened that view, as the motive was clearly to leave a slot through which to shoot. Lastly, the medical evidence showed that if the Llewellyns were sitting where Miss Blair Booth stated, and the shots were fired from where she said, the bullets would have entered the bodies from the direction they were actually found to have done. But Miss Blair Booth's detractors were loath to recede from the position they had taken up. They stated that of the objections to their theory, only one, the wedging of the doors, was overwhelming, and they advanced an ingenious theory to meet it. They suggested that before reaching Preston, Miss Blair Booth had left the compartment, closing the door after her, that she had then wedged it, and that on stopping at the station she had passed out through some other compartment, re-entering their own through the outside door. In answer to this, it was pointed out that the gentleman who had eaten the fruit had opened his door after the Preston stop, and if Miss Blair Booth was then shut into her compartment, she could not have wedged the other door. That two people should be concerned in the wedging was unthinkable. It was therefore clear that Miss Blair Booth was innocent, and that some other person had wedged both doors, in order to prevent his operations in the corridor being interfered with by those who would hear the shots. It was recognised that similar arguments applied to the four men in the end compartment. The wedging of the doors cleared them also. Defeated on these points, the theorists retired from the field. No further suggestions were put forward by the public or the daily press. Even to those behind the scenes, the case seemed to become more and more difficult the longer it was pondered. Each person known to have been present came in turn under the microscopic eye of New Scotland Yard, but each in turn had to be eliminated from suspicion, till it almost seemed proved that no murder could have been committed at all. The prevailing mystification was well summed up by the chief at the yard in conversation with the inspector in charge of the case. "Troublesome business, certainly," said the great man, "and I admit that your conclusion seems sound, but let us go over it again. There must be a flaw somewhere." "There must, sir, but I've gone over it till I'm stupid, and every time I get the same result." "We'll try once more. We begin, then, with a murder in a railway carriage. We're sure it was a murder, of course?" "Certain, sir. The absence of the revolver and the powder blackening and the wedging of the doors prove it." "Quite. The murder must therefore have been committed by some person who was either in the carriage when it was searched or had left it before that. Let us take these two possibilities in turn. First, with regard to the searching, was that efficiently done?" "Absolutely, sir. I've gone into it with the guard and the attendants. No one could have been overlooked." "Very good. Taking first, then, those who were in the carriage, there were 6 compartments. In the first were the 4 men, and in the second Mr. Blair Booth. Are you satisfied these were innocent?" "Perfectly, sir. The wedging of the doors eliminated them." "So I think. The third and fourth compartments were empty, but in the fifth there were 2 gentlemen. What about them?" "Well, sir, you know who they were. Sir Gordon Maclean, the great engineer, and Mr. Silas Hemphill, the professor of Aberdeen University, both utterly beyond suspicion." "But as you know, Inspector, no one is beyond suspicion in a case of this kind." "I admit it, sir, and therefore I made careful inquiries about them, but I only confirmed my opinion. From inquiries I have also made, I feel sure you're right." "That brings us to the last compartment, the ladies only. What about those 3 ladies?" "The same remarks apply. Their characters are also beyond suspicion, and as well as that, the mother is elderly and timid, and couldn't brazen out a lie. I question if the daughters could either. I made inquiries all the same, and found not the slightest ground for suspicion." "The corridors and lavatories were empty?" "Yes, sir." "Then everyone found in the coach when the train stopped may be definitely eliminated?" "Yeah, it's quite impossible it could have been any that we've mentioned." "Then the murderer must have left the coach." "He must, and that's where our difficulty comes in." "I know, but let us proceed. Our problem then really becomes, how did he leave the coach?" "That's so, sir, and I have never been against anything stiffer." The chief paused in thought, as he absently selected and lit another cigar. At last he continued, "Well, at any rate, it's clear he did not go through the roof or the floor or any part of the fixed framing or sides. Therefore, he must have gone in the usual way, through a door. Of these, there is one at each end and 6 at each side. He therefore went through one of these 14 doors. You agreed, Inspector?" "Certainly, sir." "Very good. Take the ends first. The vestibule doors were locked." "Yes, sir, both ends of the coach, but I don't count that much. An ordinary carriage key opened them, and a murderer could have had one." "Quite. Now, just go over again our reason for thinking he did not escape to the sleeper." "Before the train stopped, sir, Miss Bintley, one of the 3 in the ladies only, was looking out into the corridor, and the 2 sleeper attendants were at the near end of their coach. After the train stopped, all 3 ladies were in the corridor, and 1 attendant was at the sleeper vestibule. All these persons swear most positively that no one but the guard passed between Preston and the searching of the carriage." "What about these attendants? Are they reliable?" "Wilcox has 17 years' service and Jeffreys 6, and both bear excellent characters. Both naturally came under suspicion of the murder, and I made the usual investigation, but there's not a scrap of evidence against them, and I'm satisfied they're all right. Certainly looks as if the murderer did not escape towards the sleeper. I'm positive of it. You see, sir, we have the testimony of 2 separate lots of witnesses, the ladies and the attendants. It's out of the question that these parties would agree to deceive the police. Conceivably, one or other might, but not both." "Yes, that seems sound. What then about the other end, the 3rd-class end?" "At that end," replied the inspector, "were Mr. and Mrs. Smith with their sick child. They were in the corridor close by the vestibule door, and no one could have passed without their knowledge. I had the child examined, and its illness was genuine. The parents are quieter persons of exemplary character, and again quite beyond suspicion. However, I was not satisfied with that, and I examined every person that travelled in the 3rd-class coach, and established 2 things. First, that no one was in it at the time it was searched who had not travelled in it from Preston, and secondly, that no one except the Smiths had left any of the compartments during the run between Preston and the emergency stop. That proves beyond question that no one left the 1st-class coach for the 3rd after the tragedy." "What about the guard himself?" "The guard's also a man of good character, but he's out of it because he was seen by several passengers, as well as the Smiths, running through the 3rd class after the brakes were applied." "It is clear, then, that the murderer must have got out through one of the 12 side doors. Take those on the compartment side first. The 1st, 2nd, 5th, and 6th compartments were occupied. Therefore, he could not have passed through them. That leaves the 3rd and 4th doors. Could he have left by either of these?" The inspector shook his head. "No, sir," he answered. "That is equally out of the question. You'll recollect that 2 of the 4 men in the end compartment were looking out along the train for a few seconds after the murder until the stop. It wouldn't have been possible to open the door and climb out onto the footboard without being seen by them. Guard Jones also looked out at that side of the van and saw no one. After the stop, these same 2 men, as well as others, were on the ground, and all agreed that none of the doors were opened at any time." Mused the chief. "That also seems conclusive, and it brings us definitively to the doors on the corridor side. As the guard arrived on the scene comparatively early, the murderer must have got out while the train was running at a fair speed. He must therefore have been clinging on to the outside of the coach while the guard was in the corridor working at the sliding doors. When the train stopped, all attention was concentrated on the opposite or compartment side, and he could easily have dropped down and made off. What do you think of that theory, Inspector?" We went into that pretty thoroughly, sir. It was first objected that the blinds of the 1st and 2nd compartments were raised too soon to give him time to get out without being seen, but I found this was not valid. At least 15 seconds must have elapsed before Miss Blair Booth and the men in the end compartment raised their blinds, and that would easily have allowed him to lower the window, open the door, pass out, raise the window, shut the door, and crouch down on the footboard out of sight. I estimate also that nearly 30 seconds had passed before Guard Jones looked out of the window at that side. As far as time goes, he couldn't have done what you suggest, but another thing shows that he didn't. It appears that when Jones ran through the third-class coach while the train was stopping, Mr. Smith, the man with the sick child, wondering what was wrong, attempted to follow him into the first class, but the door slammed after the guard before the other could reach it, and of course the spring lock held it fast. Mr. Smith, therefore, lowered the end corridor window and looked out ahead, and he states positively no one was on the footboard of the first class. To see how far Mr. Smith could be sure of this, on a dark night we ran the same carriage, lighted in the same way, over the same part of the line, and we found a figure crouching on the footboard was clearly visible from the window. It showed a dark mass against the lighted side of the cutting. When we remembered that Mr. Smith was specially looking out for something abnormal, I think we may accept his evidence. You are right, it is convincing, and of course it is supported by the guard's own testimony. He also saw no one when he looked out of his van. That's so, sir, and we found a crouching figure was visible from the van also, owing to the same cause, the lighted bank. And the murderer could not have got out while the guard was passing through the third class. No, because the corridor blinds were raised before the guard looked out. The chief frowned. It's certainly puzzling, he mused. There was silence for some moments, and then he spoke again. Could the murderer, immediately after firing the shots, have concealed himself in a lavatory and then, during the excitement of the stop, have slipped out unperceived through one of these corridor doors and, dropping on the line, moved quietly away? No, sir. We went into that also. If he'd hidden in the lavatory, he couldn't have got out again. If he'd gone towards the third class, the Smiths would have seen him, and the first-class corridor was under observation during the entire time from the arrival of the guard till the search. We've proved the ladies entered the corridor immediately the guard passed their compartment, and two of the four men in the end smoker were watching out through their door till considerably after the ladies had come out. Again silence reigned, while the chief smoked thoughtfully. The coroner had some theory, you say? He said at last. Yes, sir. He suggested the murderer might have, immediately after firing, got up by one of the doors on the corridor side, probably the end one, and from there climbed on the outside of the coach to some place from which he could not be seen from a window, dropping to the ground when the train stopped. He suggested the roof, the buffers, or the lower step. This seemed likely at first sight, and I therefore tried the experiment, but it was no good. The roof was out of the question. It was one of those high curved roofs, not flat clerestory, and there was no handhold at the edge above the doors. The buffers were equally inaccessible. From the handle and guard of the end door to that above the buffer on the corner of the coach was 7 feet 2 inches. That is to say, a man couldn't reach from one end to the other, and there was nothing he could hold on while he was passing along the step. The lower step wasn't possible either. In the first place, it was divided. There was only a short step beneath each door, not a continuous board like the upper one, so that no one could pass along the lower while holding on to the upper. And secondly, I couldn't imagine anyone climbing down there and knowing that the first platform they came to would sweep him off. That is to say, Inspector, you have proved the murderer was in the coach at the time of the crime, that he was not in it when it was searched, and that he did not leave it in the interval. I don't know that that is a very creditable conclusion. I know, sir. I regret it extremely, but that's the difficulty I've been up against from the start. The chief laid his hand on his subordinate's shoulder. It won't do, he said kindly. It really won't do. You try again, smoke over it, and I'll do the same, and come in and see me again tomorrow. But the conversation had really summed up the case justly. My Lady Nicotine brought no inspiration, and as time passed without bringing to light any further facts, interest gradually waned, till at last the affair took its place among the long list of unexplained crimes in the annals of New Scotland Yard. And now I come to the singular coincidence referred to earlier, whereby I, an obscure medical practitioner, came to learn the solution of this extraordinary mystery. With the case itself I had no connection, the details just given being taken from the official reports made at the time, to which I was allowed access in return for the information I brought. The affair happened in this way. One evening, just 4 weeks ago, as I lit my pipe after a long and tiring day, I received an urgent summons to the principal inn of the little village near where I practised. A motorcyclist had collided with a car at a crossroads and had been picked up terribly injured. I saw almost at a glance that nothing could be done for him. In fact, his life was a matter of a few hours. He asked coolly how it was with him, and in accordance with my custom in such cases, I told him, inquiring was there anyone he would like sent for. He looked me straight in the eyes and replied, "Doctor, I want to make a statement. If I tell it you, will you keep it to yourself while I live, and then inform the proper authorities and the public?" "Why, yes," I answered, "but shall I not send for some of your friends or a clergyman?" "No, I have no friends, and I have no use for parsons." "You look a white man. I'd rather tell you." I bowed and fixed him up as comfortably as possible, and he began speaking slowly in a voice hardly above a whisper. "I shall be brief, for I feel my time is short. You remember some few years ago a Mr. Horatio Llewellyn and his wife were murdered in a train on the Northwestern, some 50 miles south of Carlisle?" I dimly remembered the case. "The sleeping car express mystery, the papers called it?" I asked. "That's it," he replied. "They never solved the mystery, and they never got the murderer, but he's going to pay now. I am he." I was horrified at the cool, deliberate way he spoke. Then I remembered that he was fighting death to make his confession, and that, whatever my feelings, it was my business to hear and record it while yet there was time. I therefore sat down and said, as gently as I could, "Whatever you tell me I shall note carefully, and at the proper time shall inform the police." His eyes, which had watched me anxiously, showed relief. "Thank you. I shall hurry. My name is Hubert Black, and I live at 24 Westbury Gardens, Hove. Until 10 years and 2 months ago I lived at Bradford, and there I made the acquaintance of what I thought was the best and most wonderful girl on God's earth, Miss Gladys Wentworth. I was poor, but she was well off. I was diffident about approaching her, but she encouraged me till at last I took my courage in both hands and proposed. She agreed to marry me, but made it a condition that our engagement was to be kept secret for a few days. I was so mad about her. I would have agreed to anything she wanted, so I said nothing, though I could hardly behave like a sane man from joy. Some time before this I'd come across Llewellyn, and he'd been friendly, and had seemed to like my company. One day we met Gladys, and I introduced him. I didn't know till later that he had followed up the acquaintanceship. A week after my acceptance there was a big dance at Halifax. I was to have met Gladys there, but at the last moment I had to wire that my mother was seriously ill, and I had to go. On my return I got a cool little note from Gladys saying she was sorry, but our engagement had been a mistake, and I must consider it at an end. I made a few inquiries, and then I learnt what had been done. "Give me some stuff, doctor. I'm going down." I poured out some brandy and held it to his lips. "That's better," he said, continuing with gasps and many pauses. Llewellyn, I found out, had been struck by Gladys for some time. He knew I was friends with her, and so he'd made up to me. He wanted the introduction I was fool enough to give him, as well as the chance of meeting her he would get with me. Then he met her when he knew I was at my work, and made hay while the sun shone. Gladys spotted what he was after, but she didn't know if he was serious. Then I proposed, and she thought she would have me, for fear the bigger fish would get off. Llewellyn was wealthy, you understand. She waited till the ball, then she hooked him, and I went overboard. Nice, wasn't it?" I didn't reply, and the man went on. "Well, after that I just went mad. I lost my head and went to Llewellyn. He laughed in my face. I felt I wanted to knock his head off, but the butler happened by, so I couldn't go on and finish him then. I needn't try to describe the hell I went through. I couldn't, anyway, but I was blind mad and lived only for revenge, and then I got it. I followed them till I got a chance, and then I killed them. I shot them in that train. I shot her first, and then as he woke and sprang up, I got him too." The man paused. "Tell me the details," I asked, and after a time he went on in a weaker voice. "I'd worked out a plan to get them on the train and had followed them all through their honeymoon, but I never got a chance till then. This time, the circumstances fell out to suit. I was behind him at Euston and heard him book to Carlisle, so I booked to Glasgow. I got into the next compartment. There was a talkative man there, and I tried to make a sort of alibi for myself by letting him think I would get out at Crewe. I did get out, but I got in again and travelled on in the same compartment with the blinds down. No one knew I was there. I waited till we got to the top of Shap, for I thought I could get away easier in a thinly populated country. Then, when the time came, I fixed the compartment doors with wedges and shot them both. I left the train and got clear of the railway, crossing the country till I came on a road. I hid during the day and walked at night till after dark on the second evening I came to Carlisle. From there I went by rail quite openly. I was never suspected." He paused, exhausted, while the dread visitor hovered closer. "Tell me," I said, "just a word. How did you get off the train?" He smiled faintly. "Some more of your stuff," he whispered. And when I had given him a second dose of brandy, he went on feebly and with long pauses which I am not attempting to reproduce. "I'd worked the thing out beforehand. I thought if I could get out on the buffers while the train was running and before the alarm was raised, I should be safe. No one looking out of the windows could see me, and when the train stopped, as I knew it soon would, I could drop down and make off. The difficulty was to get from the corridor to the buffers. I did it like this. I'd bought about 16 feet of fine brown silk cord and the same length of thin silk rope. When I got out at Crewe, I moved to the corner of the coach and stood close by it, by way of getting shelter to light a cigarette. Without anyone seeing what I was up to, I slipped the end of the cord through the bracket handle above the doors. Then I strolled to the nearest door, paying out a cord, but holding on to its two ends. I pretended to fumble at the door as if it was stiff to open, but all the time I was passing the cord through the handle guard and knotting the ends together. If you followed me, you realise that this gave me a loop of fine silk connecting the handles at the corner and the door. It was the colour of the carriage and was nearly invisible. Then I took my seat again. When the time came to do the job, I first wedged the corridor doors. Then I opened the outside window and drew in the end of the cord loop and tied the end of the rope to it. I pulled one side of the cord loop and so got the rope pulled through the corner bracket handle and back again to the window. Its being silk made it run easily and without marking the bracket. Then I put an end of the rope through the handle guard and, after pulling it tight, knotted the ends together. This gave me a loop of rope tightly stretched from the door to the corner. I opened the door and then pulled up the window. I let the door close up against a bit of wood I'd brought. The wind kept it to, and the wood prevented it from shutting. Then I fired. As soon as I saw that both were hit, I got outside. I kicked away the wood and shut the door. Then, with the rope for handrail, I stepped along the footboard to the buffers. I cut both the cord and the rope and drew them after me and shoved them in my pocket. This removed all traces. When the train stopped, I slipped down on the ground. The people were getting out at the other side, so I had only to creep along close to the coaches till I got out of their light. Then I climbed up the bank and escaped. The man had evidently made a desperate effort to finish, for as he ceased speaking his eyes closed, and in a few minutes he fell into a state of coma which shortly preceded his death. After communicating with the police, I set myself to carry out his second injunction. And this statement is the result. If you like that story, consider supporting me as a patron. That way you help me make more stories for you and get access to a patrons-only library of stories. Lots more hours for you to listen to. Hi, so that was The Mystery of the Sleeping Car Express, published in 1956. written by Freeman Wills Crofts, 1879 to 1957, and I'm Tony Walker. I'm only mentioning who I am again because a couple of things have happened. So a number of my videos were pirated and just lumped on somebody else. 2 channels actually did it, and I've been trying to get YouTube to take them down, although relatively successfully. But some of them, sometimes YouTube say, well, what is the copyright issue? And I'm going, it's my performance, love. It's my performance. So anyway, so I'm just mentioning my name again. Just so if you're hearing this and it isn't on my channel, it's been pirated. So I would much prefer if you listen to it on my channel, which is the Classic Detective Stories podcast. So anyway, after that little preamble, let's talk about Freeman Wills Crofts. So he was born in Dublin, but into the Anglo-Irish ascendancy, I think they used to call it. So he was raised amidst the Victorian ethos that fostered both intellectual pursuits and technical skills. He was formally educated at the Methodist College and Campbell College in Belfast, after which he embarked on a career in civil engineering, specifically in railway construction. I think we might these days describe him as a railway nerd. He wrote a number of stories and novels based on the railways. The 12:30 from Croydon, the Hog's Back mystery, which is a railway. So they're a hallmark of his literary output, intertwining his expertise in civil engineering and knowledge of railways and detective fiction. And I think when you see it, you can see he has a very tidy mind. I really, lay my cards on the table, I really enjoyed that story. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about his life in a second, but just to say how well constructed it was. It flowed. I had no problems, and I suppose you didn't either, with understanding exactly what he was talking about. We could visualize the carriage, the railway car, I think they call them in the USA, the railway carriage. We could it was so precise. Everything was so precise when people did such a things, how they opened the door, how it was all done. I think, and it is a classic, what they called a locked room mystery, and I'll come back to that a little bit more as well. But everything was set out, wasn't it? But what it does have in common with classic detective story fiction, and the fair play convention might be invoked here, is that you would never have guessed, I would never have guessed, maybe you are a railway nerd dating from the early 20th century, but the silk rope, even the description of this one length of rope being a certain length and then it's tied to a smaller length, and it's all very elaborately planned out, isn't it? I didn't think particularly the denouement at the end of it was like what they call ellipsis. There's a technique called ellipsis, which is you hint at something and you delay. You don't actually explain it. So a simple explanation of this, or a simple example of this, is the tall man lurked at the station's edge. Yeah. And the question, and that's the first sentence. The question is, who's the tall man? What's he lurking for? You know, and it creates these open question loops, and we just can't help ourselves. We want to know more, and so. He introduces it at the beginning, and he says, this was a mystery to everybody, but I happen to have fallen into my lap the solution. And actually, we don't hear that solution till the very end, when the deathbed confection, he was obviously a cake maker, the deathbed confession of the motorcyclist is, and I didn't find that at all jarring. I thought, oh yeah, okay, that could be, that's very plausible. So I think it was beautifully constructed. Although what I was saying about fair play is, you remember the conventions, I think dating from 1928, of the conventions of the detective novel, it became the convention that the novelist should put clues into the narrative, even if they are the sleight of hand. Red herrings are allowed, and kind of deflecting you away from the clue, but putting the clue in. Well, he doesn't do that, so you could say that it's in contravention of the doctrine of fair play, which became prevalent in Golden Age fiction. But I didn't mind that at all. I think how it worked for me was, we have the mystery, and when the details of the case are set out, you're naturally saying, oh, how did that work? And every And then he has a recap of that when the chief inspector and the inspector, I think it is, or the superintendent and the inspector are discussing the case, and the superintendent is like not a devil's advocate, but almost like an exposition, isn't it? So a Socratic questioning, I suppose it is. So the top copper puts forward a case only for the inspector who's been on the ground. And also, I think this betrays the engineer's preference for empirical facts. So theory's all very well, but engineers like to get their hands dirty, don't they? And, well, I say that, I'm not an engineer, but I've met plenty of people walking around with dirty hands, and I looked at them, I thought, you're engineers. I know it. Look at the grease. But anyway, so you know, the guy who we trust is the man who's been on the street. Yeah, I tried that. I did that. I checked that out. Real, proper empirical measurements that would appeal to an engineer, and we still couldn't figure it out. And so we have the case set forward, and it's mysterious, and every single aspect of it, when it's looked into, appears to defy explanation. And then we have a recap of that, just in case you haven't got it. Now, actually, if I was being really critical, I would have said to Freeman, or may I call you Free? May I be free with your name? Freeman, I might say, look, the recap, the reader's already got this, you needn't recap it. I mean, it might serve some purpose. I mean, I'm not totally against it, but if I was his editor, I might say we could probably lose this and not lose much. Lose something, but not too much. Anyway, but after saying that, I really admired the story. And I was going to say the narrative drive of it, in a sense, the drive of the plot is this mystery, all these open loops. How was it done? And we may it's like a salesman's technique, isn't it? The salesman, I'm not a salesman either, but I've seen plenty of them around, and I look at them and I go, oh no, I've done that joke, and it wasn't even funny the first time. And you see the salesman, and they're out there. Yeah, they know what the client's objections are going to be, or the prospect's objections are going to be. So they raise them and they knock them down. And so this is what he's doing. And what really made me laugh was, well, not out loud, was smile, maybe, to myself. Smirk, snigger, who knows. But was the conspiracy theorists. He just calls them theorists, doesn't he? And you see this on Facebook. Some poor unfortunate comes to a terrible end, and all these amateur sleuths come forward with they're absolutely in the way of autodidacts, and I speak as one. The passionate conviction we have that we are right because it's our pet theory. Well, I think this happened, and you see this all the time. But it's really interesting to realize that this isn't just a modern. It may be new on Facebook, but you know, it was happening in the newspapers all the time. And in fact, I think Dickens talks about this as well. That you know, when the Jack the Ripper was about, there were lots of people putting their theories forward in the newspaper. So it isn't a modern thing, but even so, it made me smile to say, you know, it's still going on, and they won't be convinced. The other thing we've got to say is, and this is a sidestep into life, from story into life, is that you can never really change somebody's mind with facts. You really can't. You can give, if they're convinced of X, and you have the facts to show that X is not correct, you can give them all the facts you want. It's not going to change their mind. But maybe there's a small percentage of people, the so-called rationalists, hyper-rationalists, who would be. But most people believe things through emotion. So you have to kind of change their emotion. That's what rhetoric's about, isn't it? Rhetoric is the art of persuasion, but and the salespeople use this a lot. You always sell things on emotion. Everything that humans do is on emotion. We may kid ourselves that we're rational. So if I have a theory that which is Miss Blair Booth murdered them, like in the story, and I'm given the facts that it's impossible for her to have done it, I'm still going to believe she did it. Just let's throw the facts out the window. Let's have the rational and the empirical observations. You know, the difference between. So somebody said I bashed the Enlightenment. Not particularly, but so the two strands that arise and existed beforehand, the ways that human beings were encouraged to explore the world. The first was through the scientific method, which has been fantastically successful, which is empirical observation. You observe, you measure, you observe, you repeat, you observe, you measure. Somebody else replicates it, and then you end up with empirical knowledge, which advances human understanding. And then the other way, of course, is philosophical knowledge, whereby we use reason to work things out. And some philosophers, as opposed to scientists, would say that philosophy was the prince of ways. But of course, the fact that we're still arguing about the same things that Socrates was probably suggests that philosophy has not been as successful. So rationality, the way of reason, has not been as successful as the way of science. However, I have philosophy now. I think it is. I'm subscribed to. I've got a new edition which I'm going to read because I like a bit of philosophy, but rather than science. I was bored by science. I hate measuring things. It's boring. But I accept that science is the way forward, and just thinking about stuff probably isn't. Anyway, I only say this. I think this is germane to Freeman, because he is an engineer and he's clearly a rationalist. And I've said what I've said about him playing fair. I don't think you could have worked that out. So I don't think he was totally being fair. But the delight of the story was the fact that it was so thoroughly presented, and all the objections or solutions were aired and knocked down. And we would never have guessed the other one. So I thought it was really good. Anyway. When he was 7, get back to Belfast. So he was working in railway construction. At the age of 17, Freeman Wills Crofts became an apprentice under his uncle, Barclay Dean Wise, who was the chief engineer of the Belfast and Northern Counties Railway. Belfast and Northern Counties Railway. Oh dear me, don't do that, Tony. This early exposure to railway engineering became a significant influence on his literary output, as his knowledge of trains, timetables, and the intricacies of transport systems would later inform many of his detective novels, particularly those featuring his most celebrated character, Inspector Joseph French, who doesn't feature in this story. But most of the detective writers ended up with a detective, didn't they? Obviously, and they mostly paraded their detective. And I think also the success of these characters is their quirkiness and how they appeal to us, and we're interested in them as people. I've said before, in the 1980s, in the golden age of BBC made-for-TV or British made-for-TV detective like Bergerac and Midsummer Murders and all this stuff, there was loads of them, and they were great, but I lost track of... I watched recently The Ink Black Heart, written by J.K. Rowling, and the Cormoran Strike, the characters of the detectives are really interesting. The milieu and the vibe of the stories is really great. The story is so complicated, I've lost track. So I think that many detective stories are read for the characters, and Inspector Joseph French was Freeman's. So it wasn't until 1919, if we work it out, he was 30, while recuperating from a serious illness, that he ventured into writing and produced his first novel, The Cask, which established him as a formidable talent in detective fiction. His subsequent works proliferated through the interwar years, affirming his reputation. He was actually really famous in the time, and he's not as famous now. During the golden age of detective fiction, he was a big cheese. The meticulous nature of his storytelling, exactly, coupled with his strong emphasis on logical reasoning and the mechanics of detection. This is his engineer's brain, which I really enjoyed. Distinguished his writing from that of contemporaries like Agatha Christie. Yeah, potentially. It feels different, doesn't it? Despite achieving notable acclaim amongst his peers, such as being praised by Raymond Chandler, we like Raymond, Crofts' name tends to be less prominent in the annals of literary history. He wrote for several decades and wrote a variety of novels, and he died in 1957 in Worthing on the south coast of England. He wasn't merely a writer, but he was a highly accomplished musician. He served as organist and choirmaster in various churches, including Killowen Parish Church and St Martin's in Blackheath, showcasing a talent that complemented his creative abilities. I don't know what that means, really. Additionally, Crofts, he was a member of the Detection Club alongside, of course, Agatha Christie, Dorothy L. Sayers. He was one of the gang. And then, of course, his unique focus on the railway. Now, if you follow the Ghost channel, you'll know LTC was an engineer, and he did the inland waterways, but also very interested in railways, and I did a ghost story of his, the Garside Fell disaster, and he strikes me as really similar in lots of ways. Engineer's mind, very practical of all the facts and the practicalities and the detail. So Crofts was very. He wasn't flamboyant, and actually his character, Inspector Joseph French, was devised as a counterpoint to the more flamboyant detectives of the era. I mean, Hercule Poirot is fairly he's a striking looking character. Sherlock Holmes, of course, same thing. Miss Marple, same thing. I mean, no, Lord Peter Wimsey. They aren't your ordinary blokes, are you? Whereas I think Crofts has his Inspector French as being methodical, rational, deeply analytical. He is steadfast logic, observation, and a thorough understanding of the processes surrounding crime. I think that's because he's Protestant. I think that's a very Protestant way of looking at things. You can shoot me down for that. I mean, I remember once upon a time when I was young, the division between Catholic and Protestant was actually, not. It could end in violence, even where I lived in the northwest of England. And it's no big deal now here, is still in different places. But definitely, my Sheila was married to a man from Derry, a Catholic, and she always says that when she was over there and they got dressed up smartly, the Irish family would go, "Oh, you're looking very Protestant today." So, and of course, I've got to say that my father, he was born in Scotland, but his family were Irish Catholics. So, I'm not, honestly, don't get offended about this, please, 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 please. No offence is meant to anybody or their dog. So there we are. That's him, really. So there were 30 novels he wrote about Inspector French. He lacks a flamboyant personality, but he is unwaveringly dedicated to uncovering the truth. We talked about his interest in railways. We might say something about the locked room mystery. So a crime, usually a murder, is committed under circumstances which it was seemingly impossible for the perpetrator to commit the crime and or evade detection, and getting in and out of the crime scene. And these were massively popular because they're like a puzzle, aren't they? You as the reader, even though he hasn't been totally fair with you and he hasn't given you everything you need to solve the problem, you as a reader, your little brain's working it. How could that work? Well, actually, you can't work it out because you don't have all the details of the silken rope. But I like saying silken. I don't know if you're fans of Tolkien, but you have Thorin Oakenshield. You have we don't use that much. Tolkien has silvern as well. So to say something is made of a material, it's golden, it's oaken, it's woolen. You used to put en on the end. I wish we still did. Leathern as well, made of leather. So these are really archaic now, but I'm going to bring them back in my speech, my daily speech. So The Locked Room, first full novel was The Woman in White, 1860. And then we have The Murders in the Rue Morgue, which we've done on the channel, 1841, is earlier than Wilkie Collins, of course. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but it's because I'll give you the spoiler now. Don't read it. I'll tell you who did it. And there you go. Of course, we've done John Dixon Carr, one of his stories. He used to do them. Gaston Leroux, who I've done his on the other channel. I've actually done the Phantom of the Opera, which I enjoyed. Go and listen to that, please. Nobody listens to it. He did The Mystery of the Yellow Room, one of the classic locked room mysteries. Early on, and very interestingly, Agatha Christie, of course, The Murder on the Orient Express, and then there were dabblings in The Locked Room. You may shoot me down for saying dabbling. I don't mean to insult Dame Agatha. If you listen to me, you know I love her work. Isaac Asimov also wrote a locked room mystery called The Acquisitive Chuckle. First story about the character Black Widowers. So those are. Ellery Queen had the Chinese Orange mystery. We've talked about The Murders in the Rue Morgue, Edgar Allan Poe, Mystery of the Yellow Room, Gaston Leroux, The Hollow Man by John Dixon Carr, and Then There Were None by Agatha Christie, Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie, The Chinese Orange Mystery. Anyway, great stuff. I really enjoy doing these detective stories. The thing is, I wasn't a big reader of detective stories, but I thought after doing my Ghost Channel, what happens with the Ghost Channel is it's very, very, very well listened to in the winter, and as we come into the spring, people stop listening to it, and it's my living now, of course. So that means, I can't. What the dog? I look at Jasper and I say, "No bones for you this week, boy." So I thought, well, I need a story genre that will not have these seasonal dips. So I thought, detective stories. And it's led me to reading more detective stories and learning about detective stories and their authors. And that's been a real pleasurable discovery and journey for me. And I know some of you listening have been long time fans of detective fiction, but I'm kind of new to the party, really. I've read some in the past, but yeah, so there we are. That's that. This week, who knows what's next week? I am not. I mean, very often I will just pick up a book and go and leaf through it, of which I've. The other excuse is to buy more books, of course. So I've got lots of collections of detective stories now, mostly secondhand. Well, I think pretty much, no, not all, but nearly all secondhand. And I leaf through them and I go, oh yeah, that's a good one. I'll do that one. So I'm not like Freeman, who I imagine would be planning, would have already at this point have planned out every week for the year ahead. I haven't done that. So for some weird reason that just cut out. But I'm determined to leave my mistakes in to prove that I'm not a robot.